Good day, class. Welcome to today's lesson. Today we continue looking at pillars of sustainable development, and today's focus will be economic viability. So, as we usually do, we begin by looking at a definition of the major term of interest, and today we are going to define economic viability. So the term viability is a measure of the likelihood of success of a particular set of decisions. All right, so that's viability in general. So as it pertains to economic viability, it relates to the success of economic decisions. And particularly in this context, we're talking about economic decisions that happen on a national level, usually at the government level. So measuring economic viability is informed by financial analysis and oftentimes complex financial analyses. And one of the common tools that is utilized to facilitate financial analysis would be cost benefit analysis. All right, so by way of reminder, cost benefit analysis, that is an expression of your costs for any particular project in relation to the benefits in monetary terms. All right, so usually we are looking at expression in monetary terms to determine whether something is economically viable or not. So as we continue, what is economic viability in terms of sustainable development? So this involves actions that preserve and regenerate a public resource. And of course, we know those public resources could come in many forms. It could be natural resources, it could be infrastructure, all of those things. Public utilities, all of these various things are public resources. So we're talking about economic viability in terms of the preservation of those resources and the regeneration of it. So regeneration meaning to make new again. All right, we're not talking about even maintaining it in a constant position, which is what preservation means, but we're talking about regeneration as well. So that's an important part of the definition of economic viability. Economic viability with regards to sustainable development also results in no decline of the welfare. So when we talk about welfare, we're talking about a welfare with regards to persons, people. Okay, so there should be no decline in their welfare. Well-being in terms of health, well-being in terms of welfare in terms of standard of living, all of these things. So these decisions are defined as economically sustainable only because or only when those behaviors or those actions that we take prevent organizations from being responsible for the so-called tragedy of the commons. So actions taken by organizations that result in, just as we pointed out, in decline in the welfare of the majority of people. Usually, say for example, a failed project in a community where at the end of the day, mostly the community suffers, all right? So since those kinds of actions are contrary to self-exploitation of resources, I think I may have a little typo there somewhere. So basically the point is that organizations that may take actions, oh no, there's no error, but organizations that may take actions that result in negative consequences for the majority of your stakeholders, this would be considered self-exploitation, all right? Exploitation of your resources, various types of resources, and the economic good that's available to everyone, all right? Because remember, most times you're talking about the public resource. So that means you have many stakeholders would have an interest in those public resources, but yet you have a scenario where you have an organization that may make a decision that results in negative outcome for everyone else. All right. So with regards to sustainable economic sustainability or viability with regards to sustainable development, again, we're talking about organizations taking decisions that prevent them from being responsible for these negative outcomes that affect multiple stakeholders. So as we continue, so in order to achieve this broad inclusive perspective, there must be relationship-based dialogue with many stakeholders, as we just pointed out. All right, because again, remember we're dealing with public resources. And as we mentioned before, the typically you find it would be businesses and governments that would usually be responsible for making decisions about projects where development is concerned. All right, so next point. So it is necessary to have a multidisciplinary approach that includes a much larger framework drawing on social and ecological perspective. So if we, we think back to some of our earlier lessons, we know that it is important for us um, when we are looking to achieve sustainable development, it's important for us to have that broad, holistic approach to decision making. It cannot be only about the bottom line in terms of dollars and cents. We must look at the social considerations as well as the ecological considerations. All right. How do those fit into your project? And how can we balance the benefits and outcomes for all your various stakeholders? So again, this is where dialogue is required. That's very important. So it's really essential, as we would have discussed in earlier lessons as well as other courses, that you have a participatory approach. All right. So our business entities are often considered the drivers of decision making, as we would have pointed out already, the decision making process with regards to resource usage. However, they also pose a threat to the viability. Remember, we said viability refers to the success of the whole system. So they cannot take unilateral decisions with regards to the usage of those resources. Otherwise, you can expect to have a failed system where there is no real economic viability in terms of moving towards achieving sustainable development. So what is the objective of sustainable economic development? The objective of sustainable economic development is to promote a change of values of organizations to include creativity, innovation, protection of our natural resources, and as well, very important here, the satisfaction of as many interests as possible should be involved. So, as a matter of fact, really, when you consider it, once you have that participatory approach and you have many other stakeholders involved in that decision-making process, the volume of information and understanding of the particular environment with regards to any proposed project, it should provide a lot of opportunity for that creativity and innovation. Because in the absence of that dialogue and that sharing on that broad perspective, it's very difficult for you to actually be able to achieve anything innovative. All right, because innovation would usually be driven by the identification of problems. Second point, there must be therefore a shift from the view of who can exercise the greatest pressure on national policies, evade and or avoid taxes, and receive the benefits for harmful activities. All right, so typically you find, or traditionally you find, that this would often be the position of a lot of organizations that might be involved in the usage and development of resources across the board. And this is something that we should be trying to change and shift that modus operandi where that is concerned, that thinking and that philosophy must change. So with that in mind, let us let us look at a theoretical framework or some basic guidelines for sustainable economic development. So number one, the state of the environment should be on a sustainable path with maximum production while taking into account each environmental problem. All right, so you must have at the highest levels, you must have that will at the highest level, such as government level, to be moving your country or your nation on a sustainable path. And if that is the case, it means then that we know and we understand at this point that a lot of background work has to be put in place, such as proper monitoring, scientific monitoring of your environment, data collection, etc., because all of that is very important towards identifying what your environmental problems are and therefore informing the decisions that you make on national policy level, and therefore those policies should also dictate what your maximum sustainable production should look like, because that means then that you would have to be setting standards. And if you look at point two, you'd have to be setting standards, allowable limits of emissions for different types of pollutions into your environment. And none of that can be done without scientific information and policy and decision making that is informed by your scientific information. All right, so point two, to achieve sustainable maximum production. So sustainable maximum production does not necessarily mean the maximum amount that you could produce, but this is what is the maximum I can produce in relation to these restrictions, right? So if you have emission limits for, let's say, carbon dioxide and various types of air pollutants, as well as other types of waste. You're looking at solid and liquid waste generation, how much is allowed. You're also looking at issues as to, as you would have seen before, what level of treatment of waste, liquid waste, hazardous waste do you have in place. So all of these things have to work in tandem with each other. So point three, so sustainable standards must be used as constraints to achieve economic balance with all other necessary components. And this can often involve changes to your production and consumption processes. All right, so we know that if we have intervention in our production processes, we can reduce waste. If we have intervention in the way we consume natural resources, etc., we can reduce waste. And much of this can be done with the aid of technology at various stages of these processes. So as it relates to economic growth, let us look briefly at Sustainable Development Goal 8. So Sustainable Development Goal 8 focuses on decent work and economic growth. So this SDG 8, envisions sustained and inclusive economic growth that can drive progress, create jobs for all, and improve living standards. All right, so basically when we're talking about sustainable development, we can't take some of these terms at face value. When we talk about progress and things like improved living standards, we're not just merely talking about having more money in your pocket and all of these things and spending power, but what what would be involved in improved living standards, for example? So living standards is not only about purchasing power of the individuals in your country, but improved living standards would look at things like levels of health, extended life expectancy, what quality of life do you have and for how many years, levels of education. Um, then you look at things like levels of pollution, because we know that the pollution will have a feedback effect on us as human beings, and even in natural environment. So where you have situation of decline in health and life expectancy, obviously you can also expect a feedback to economic growth, because now you have less people able to work and produce and contribute to the economic development. So it's very important that we understand that sustainability, in terms of the social and environmental aspect and economic development, we cannot operate in silos. We cannot separate them. They are all interconnected. So in 2020 and beyond, COVID-19 has disrupted many lives and endangered the global economy, making the achievement of this goal even more difficult, right? So now you have an external factor and a global one at that, that now makes it even more difficult, an added challenge here towards achieving sustainable economic growth and development. What are some of the things that came out of this situation? We have increased unemployment. We have increasing gender gaps in terms of earning power and decision making. For example, what we found in many parts of the world, for example, you found that with so much homeschooling and remote learning taking place at home, this became additional pressure on parents. We found that a lot of women actually had to stay home, but some of them even leaving their jobs, thus reducing the earning power of the household and also the decision-making power of women in the workplace, because there are now less and less of them there. All right, so we have a situation where this external factor of this global pandemic has now made sustainable economic development even more challenging. So what happened with many countries, such as Trinidad and Tobago, we had to depend on and we had to tap into our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Now, not all countries have the benefit of this type of safety net. But fortunately for Trinidad and Tobago, we did have that. So we had to tap in order to mitigate the effects of economic and social impacts from the COVID-19. All right. Um, but as the COVID continues beyond 2020, it limits, we have finite funds. The global economy is affected. Our GDP is affected. There's little opportunity to replenish, and as we talked about, even regenerate our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So consider the challenges here to economic growth, and in particular, sustainable economic growth in these kinds of situations and conditions. So let us look a little closer at some of our Sustainable Development Goals indicators for SDG 8. All right. So as I said here, there are 10 targets, but only a few are identified. So our targets are located here in our left column. We have a brief description of what the target is and a few examples of indicators. So we have sustainable economic growth. So typically for the least developed countries, what you're looking for is an economic growth of your GDP of at least 7%. All right. So what data would you collect to indicate something like that? you're looking at annual growth rate of your GDP per capita. All right, so some of these terms I should not have to be explaining to you at this stage. You're supposed to know what that means. So obviously, if for the least developed countries, you're looking for 7%, it means that for more developed countries, you are looking at greater than that. Point two, increased productivity. So you're looking at increased productivity that could be achieved through diversification of your economy. So countries like Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the Caribbean that have been heavily dependent on one sector or another, Trinidad and Tobago for the petroleum sector, other parts of the Caribbean tourism sector, that is always a weakness in terms of resilience to some of these external factors, such as what we are dealing with in the world at present with regards to COVID. All right, so increased productivity can increase through diversification, technological upgrading and innovation, as well as including a high focus on value added and labor intensive sectors. Here, labor intensive with regards to creating more employment. All right, so how can we measure this? We might want to look at the annual growth rate of real GDP per employed person. So notice here we talked about per capita, but here we're talking about our focus is on the number of employed persons. So growth rate in relation to the number of employed persons. Resource efficiency. So this is evidenced by efficient patterns of consumption and production, as well as reduced environmental degradation. So we're looking at trying to achieve a balance here, efficiency in consumption and production, and as well as looking for evidence of reduced environmental degradation. What can we measure? We're looking at patterns and trends in our domestic material consumptions. Is it reducing? Domestic consumption per capita, is that reducing? And material consumption per GDP. So we're looking, essentially, we want to see a downward trend in terms of material consumption. Safe working conditions, as evidenced by the promotion of labor rights, safe and secure working environments for all, particularly, more disadvantaged groups like immigrants and women, etc. And data that you would look to measure or indicators: fatal and non-fatal occupational injuries per 100,000 workers by gender and migrant status. So these are just a few of the indicators that as decision makers, you will have to look for in terms of your progress, a country's progress or a region's progress towards economic viability as it relates to sustainable development. So I would like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson, and I would like to refer you to eClassroom, the eClassroom page for this course for this week's lesson, for this week's activity. Please note the due dates. Thank you.